Who were the Bethlehem Shepherds? Why were they important enough for St. Luke to include in his gospel? And what have we gotten wrong about them over the centuries? Joining me now to answer these questions and more, author of the new book, The Secret of the Bethlehem Shepherds, Father Dwight Longenecker. Father Dwight, Merry Christmas. Thank you for being here. Why are the shepherds so important to St. Luke and his telling of the story of the birth of Christ? And why do they remain such a presence, do you think, after multiple generations here, millennium?
Well, I think they were important to St. Luke because they were relatively famous in their day. And to understand all this, we have to try to understand the beginnings of the New Testament. So remember, by the time St. Luke is writing down the story of Jesus' birth, this is at least 40 or 50 or more years after the events. So we have to ask ourselves, how did that story actually get from 40 or, descend to 40 or 50 years until St. Luke could actually hear it? And I believe from my research that it was actually the Bethlehem Shepherds themselves who passed the story on to their descendants, who became the early church in Bethlehem, and that those people actually passed the story on to St. Luke, maybe the next generation or even two generations after the actual events.
Well, in 2017, you wrote a book that I loved, The Mystery of the Magi. And it set the record straight about what we truly know about the Magi. That history, by the way, was a big influence on my picture book, led me down many interesting roads. What drew you to want to find out more about not only the shepherds of Bethlehem, but all of these figures surrounding the Nativity, and to put them in a proper historical context?
Well, the reason it's important to me is because, the story of Christmas is very magical. The story itself has lots of so-called magical elements. There's angels, there's messages from angels, there's some mysterious wizards from supposedly the Far East who supposedly follow a magical star across the desert sands. There's animals, there's a mother, a newborn child, all these charming, somewhat beautiful elements to the story, and therefore it lends itself to further elaboration over the century. And in the book, I liken it to being a Christmas tree, a bare Christmas tree, but then we add lots of ornaments to it. And the bare story of Christmas has added lots of magical elements to the already quite marvelous elements in the Bible. And then secular Christmas has added even more magical elements, like a magical elf who flies through the sky on Christmas Eve and squeezes down everybody's chimney to give them gifts. Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, a flying snowman. All these other magical elements have come into this magical time of Christmas, which makes a lot of people think that the whole story's magical and a make-believe, as if the whole story of Mary and Joseph and baby Jesus and the shepherds and the wise men is also no more than a fairy tale.
Yeah.
So I wanted to go through and go back and say, well, actually, this is rooted in real history, and what did the real history look like?
And you argue that much of what we know about the shepherds, the Bethlehem Shepherds, is historically incorrect, inaccurate. How so?
Well, this is because over the centuries, of course, remember, by the time the story comes to us, it's now 2,000 years later. And by the time it's come to us, it's been filtered through various different eons and different cultures for the last 2,000 years. So the time the Christmas story gets to us in America in the 21st century, it's accumulated even more elements which aren't original to the story itself. So, for instance, we all have a crib set in our home or in our church, which is usually a rustic-looking stable or barn with the figures inside. Well, that comes to us from St. Francis, and I guess it would have been the 12th or 13th century, and the stable that we're looking at, therefore, is a kind of stable from Europe in the Middle Ages. And it makes sense that people in the Middle Ages in Europe would have thought that a stable was like that, but in fact, a stable for people in first century Palestine was very different.
And what was it like, Father? Describe what that stable would have looked like in that first century. And what does the historical record tell us about these shepherds of Bethlehem?
Well, when you go to the Holy Land, one of the things that is striking is how many caves they have. And they'll say, here's the cave where Jesus was born. Here's the cave where he was buried. Here's the cave where Mary was born. And you're saying, were all these people cavemen? Did they live in caves? And the fact of the matter is, they did live in caves right back through the ancient times. that area of Palestine with soft limestone hills is very amenable to natural caves and digging man-made caves as well, or extending the natural caves. And
Mhm.
so if you go to Palestine and the West Bank even today, you will find Bedouin tents and small houses built in front of caves. So the houses were built in front of the caves, and sometimes they lived in the caves, and sometimes they lived in the houses in front of the caves, but they used the caves for their stable, to stable their animals.
Hmm. And what do we know about these wise men? Why would God choose I mean, shepherds rather? Why would God choose these shepherds to be the first eyewitnesses of the events in Bethlehem on the night of Jesus' birth?
First of all, we need to know more about Bethlehem at the time. Bethlehem at the time was a simple agricultural village. You know, the idea that we have a little town of Bethlehem with cute little houses and a star shining overhead. Well, that's the stuff of Christmas cards, which is all very pretty, but it would have been a very simple agricultural village with small houses built in front of caves along little narrow pathways. And that understanding of Bethlehem helps us to also understand who lived in Bethlehem.
Mm.
And the people who lived in Bethlehem were mostly nomadic shepherds, semi
Mm.
nomadic shepherds. They lived in a town, but they wandered out and about to find pasture and grazing for their flocks. And
Mm.
so when they come to speak to the shepherds, they're basically speaking to the general, simple population of Bethlehem at the time.
Mm. In the book, you write about the appearance of the angels to the shepherds and why their message is significant. The angel's message to the shepherds, for those who might have forgotten, is be not afraid, for behold, I bring you good news of a great joy, which will come to all the people. For to you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. And this will be a sign for you. You will find a babe wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger. Why were the manger and swaddling clothes a sign to the shepherds about who this Jesus was? And why do you think that's present in the story?
Well, you know, there is a kind of theory or story going around that the shepherds were actually sacred shepherds and they were raising the lambs that would be sacrificed in the temple in Jerusalem, just 5 or 6 miles away. And that the shepherds would take a newborn lamb and they would wrap it in strips of cloth and lay it in a little feeding trough, waiting for the priest to come and examine the lamb to see if it was suitable for sacrifice.
Ah.
Well, one of the reasons I went to Bethlehem and researched this was to try to see if there's any evidence for that. And I'm afraid to say, as far as we can tell, there is no evidence for that.
Hmm.
Okay, that's a story or a preaching point which seems rather good and seems rather nice, and it would be nice if it were true, but I'm afraid we can't find any evidence for that. But what we do find is that there is evidence that the animals that were kept in this 5 or 6 mile area between Jerusalem and Bethlehem were actually designated for temple sacrifice. So at
Hmm.
least part of that story is true, and that is that the shepherds were probably raising some of the animals to be used in the temple sacrifice. In other words,
Hmm.
they were raising the Lamb of God. Therefore, when they went and saw this baby, and remember, they and their ancestors had lived in Bethlehem for generations. And for generations, Bethlehem was known as the city of David and the city of the shepherd king.
Huh.
So they would have known the prophecies about the Messiah or the new shepherd king coming from the city of David. So when the angels announced that to them, they would have put two and two together and said, perhaps this is the Messiah we're all looking for.
Why do you think it's important, Father, for people to understand? I mean, I love the fact that that story, which I've heard many times from the pulpit, it's not true. And some people get rattled. They're disturbed. Look, I've had people come up to me during book signings and say, why do you have to, you're dispensing with a tradition. They feel you're somehow disrupting their traditional take on Christmas. What would you tell them?
Well, you know, the stories of Christmas, I sometimes liken it to the story of King Arthur. There was a real King Arthur in probably Roman Britain who was a Celtic chieftain. This is a historical sort of root of the story of King Arthur. But look at all the stuff that spun out of King Arthur: medieval poetry, 19th century poetry, Disney films, a Broadway musical, endless TV shows, and so forth, all about King Arthur and Merlin and Lancelot and Guinevere and all that great stuff. All of that's fine, but if you're looking for the historical Arthur, you're going to cut through all that stuff to find the historical Arthur as well. So in my book, I say, look, all the decorations to our Christmas story, the little drummer boy, the fourth wise man, the littlest shepherd, all this sort of stuff it's fine, but remember it's ornament, it's decoration on the tree. It's not the historical fact.
What's the big takeaway you want people to have after reading The Secret of the Bethlehem Shepherds?
I think one of the things that impressed upon me when I was in Jerusalem for 2 months earlier this year to research the book was to realize, wow, yes, this really happened. The stories of the gospel took place here in this place. These stones speak to us. These towns are still here. These villages are still here. When you go to Bethlehem, you can see wandering in the fields there even today, shepherds with their flocks.
Yeah.
You can still find people living in caves and houses outside of caves, even in the Holy Land today. So you can say, this happened. This is where it took place. The Son of God was born of Mary here in this place. And we can visit the Church of the Nativity and be almost certain that this is the actual spot where he was born.
Yeah, and that's a great gift, I think, to rescue it from the mythology that surrounded it over time.
Exactly.
Yeah. Father Dwight Longenecker, thank you so much for being here. The Secret of the Bethlehem Shepherds is available now at bookstores everywhere, online. And Father joins me on a special Fox Nation production, December 16th, The Wise Men Who Found Christmas. His work in this area also is exemplary, and he's featured prominently in the special. I hope you join us for that as well. Father Longenecker, Merry Christmas. Thank you for being here.
Thanks very much.